Section 6 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Catharine of Aragon, Chapter 1, Part 2. A most uncandid mystery is made of the time and place of this marriage by the early historians. Both, however, we have satisfactorily discovered in the pages of Catharine's native chroniclers. Doña Catalina, says Bernaldez, wedded the brother of her first lord, who was called Enrico, in a place called Granuche (Greenwich), on the day of St. Bernabo, June 11th, and was crowned afterwards on the day of St. John with all the rejoicings in the world. Her father, King Ferdinand, was so well pleased, adds another Spanish historian, at his daughter's second marriage, that he celebrated it by grand festivals in Spain, particularly by the Heu de Canes, or darting the Jerdide, in which Moorish sport Ferdinand assisted in person. King Henry and Queen Catherine came to the Tower from Greenwich, attended by many of the nobility, June 21st. After creating 24 knights, Henry, accompanied by Catherine, on the 23rd of June, proceeded in state through the streets of London, which were hung for the occasion with tapestry. The inhabitants of Cornhill, as the richest citizens, displayed cloth of gold. From Cornhill and the Old Change, the way was lined with young maidens, dressed in virgin white, bearing palms of white wax in their hands. These damsels were marshalled and attended by priests in their richest robes, who censed the queen's procession with silver censers as it passed. Of all the pageants ever devised for royalty, this was the most ideal and beautiful. At that time Catherine was pleasing in person. There were few women, says Lord Herbert, who could compete with Queen Catherine in her prime. She had been married but a few days, and was attired as a bride in white embroidered satin. Her hair, which was black and very beautiful, hung at length down her back, almost to her feet. She wore on her head a coronal set with many rich orient stones. The queen, thus attired as a royal bride, was seated in a litter of white cloth of gold, borne by 2 white horses. She was followed by the female nobility of England, drawn in whirly coats, a species of car that preceded the use of coaches. Thus she proceeded to the Palace of Westminster, where diligent preparation was making for the coronation next day. Cavendish asserts that all the orders for the king's coronation and the funeral of Henry VII were given by Catherine. The illness of the king's grandmother and the youth of the king were, perhaps, the reasons that she had thus to exert herself. After the coronation, the banquet was spread in Westminster Hall. The king and queen proceeded from the abbey to an elevated stage at the upper end of the hall. Several ladies of high rank sat under the table at the queen's feet, holding her pocket handkerchief, table napkins, fan, and purse. The pageantry on the occasion of this royal marriage and coronation was of a most elaborate and tedious species. One of the sports in honour of the gentle and benevolent Catherine was remarkably barbarous and savage. A miniature park was railed in before Westminster Palace. Deer and dogs were turned in. The deer overleaped the fences and escaped into the palace, where the hunters pursued and killed them, and presented the slaughtered creatures, warm and palpitating, to the royal bride. These festivities were broken up on the 29th of June by the death of the king's grandmother, Margaret of Richmond, who had been regent till 2 days before the coronation, when Henry VIII completed his 18th year. A great pestilence broke out in the metropolis at this time, which made the court retreat to Richmond Palace, when Henry entered into pageants, masking, and diversions of the like nature, with all the avidity of a grown-up child. Catherine was naturally of a sedate and reflective character. She was rather more than 5 years older than her husband, and had been trained to serious occupation by her mother, one of the greatest female sovereigns that ever reigned. These circumstances gave her a taste for practical business. It was at the Christmas festivals at Richmond, the same year, that Henry VIII stole from the side of the queen during the jousts, and returned in the disguise of a strange knight, astonishing all the company with the grace and vigour of his tilting. At first the king appeared ashamed of taking a public part in these gladiatorial exercises, but the applause he received on all sides soon induced him openly to appear on every occasion in the tilt-yard. Catherine kindly humoured the childish taste of her husband for disguising and maskings by pretending great surprise when he presented himself before her in some assumed character. On one occasion he came unexpectedly into her chamber with his cousin, Bourchier, Earl of Essex, and other nobles in the disguise of Robin Hood and his men. Whereat, says Holinshed, the queen and her ladies were greatly amazed, as well for the strange sight as for their sudden appearance. At Shroventide, soon after, the foreign ambassadors were invited to partake with the court of a goodly banquet in the Parliament chamber at Westminster. The king, after conducting the queen to her throne, and having saluted the visitors, suddenly disappeared, but soon after returned with the Earl of Essex, dressed after the Turkish fashion, and the Earl of Wiltshire and Fitzwater in the costume of Russia, with furred hats of grey, each of them having a hatchet in hand, and wearing boots, with pikes turned up. Next came Sir Edward Howard and Sir Thomas Parr, after the fashion of Persia, followed by torch-bearers with black faces, who were intended to represent Moors. The king's beautiful young sister, the Princess Mary, accompanied by some of Catherine's ladies, danced a masking ballet before her, but the princess hid her fair face under a black gauze mask, having assumed the character of an Ethiop queen. In all these maskings and pageants, the queen's device, the pomegranate, was seen mingled with the roses of York and Lancaster, and the Tudor device of the hawthorn, with its scarlet fruit. The queen's situation promising an heir to the throne, she took to her chamber at the close of the year 1510, with the usual ceremonies, being then residing at Richmond Palace. On New Year's Day she brought into the world a prince, whose welcome appearance gave rise to fresh rejoicings and more elaborate pageantry. The young prince was named Henry, at a splendid christening. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Earl of Surrey, and the king's favourite aunt, Catherine, Countess of Devonshire, were the sponsors to the royal babe. Before the queen's churching, the king rode on a pilgrimage to the Lady Shrine of Walsingham, in order to return thanks for the birth of his heir. On his return, grand tournaments were held in honour of the queen at Westminster. At the opening of the tournament appeared the king's favourite, Sir Charles Brandon, afterwards created Duke of Suffolk, who came before Catherine, disguised like hermit poor, with grey gown and lowly weeds, craving permission to tilt in her honour. When leave was given, Brandon flung off his hermit grey, and appeared armed as a champion of proof. This was considered by the populace as a most brilliant invention. In the evening, when the queen was set in glorious state in the White Hall at Westminster, a nobleman entered to inform her how that in garden of pleasure was an arbour of gold full of ladies, who were very desirous of showing pastime for the queen's diversion. Catherine answered very graciously, that both she and her ladies would be happy to behold them and their pastime. Then a great curtain of arras was withdrawn, and the pageant moved forward. It was an arbour made with posts and pillars, covered with gold, about which were twined branches of hawthorn, roses, and eglantines, all made of satin and silk, according to the natural colours of the flowers. In the arbour were 6 fair ladies in gowns of white and green satin, their gowns covered with letters of gold, being H and K, knit together in gold lacing. Near the bowers stood the king himself and 5 lords, dressed in purple satin, likewise covered with gold letters, H and K, and every one had his name in letters of bullion gold. The king's name was Ker Loyal, and all the rest bore some such appellations. Then the king and his company danced before Catherine's throne. But while this fine fancy ball was performing, a very different scene was transacting in the lower end of the White Hall. The golden arbour, which was intended to receive again the illustrious performers, had been rolled back to the end of the hall, where stood a vast crowd of the London populace, who were the constant witnesses of the grand doings of the English court in the Middle Ages, and indeed, on some occasions, seemed to have assimilated with the chorus of the Greek drama. Their proceedings this evening were, however, not quite so dignified. The arbor of gold having been rolled incautiously within reach of their inquisitive fingers, the foremost began to pluck and pull at its fine ornaments. At last they made a regular inbreak, and completely stripped the pageant of all its ornaments. Nor could the lord steward of the palace repel these intruders, without having recourse to a degree of violence which must have disturbed the royal ballet. Meantime the king and his band, having finished their stately pavans and corontos high with the utmost success, his majesty, in high good humour, bade the ladies come forward and pluck the golden letters and devices from his dress and that of his company. Little did the young king imagine what pickers and stealers were within hearing, for scarcely had he given leave for this courtly scramble, when forward rushed the plebeian intruders, and seizing not only on him but his noble guests, plucking them bare of every glittering thing on their dresses with inconceivable celerity. What was worse, the poor ladies were despoiled of their jewels, and the king was stripped to his doublet and drawers. As for the unfortunate Sir Thomas Knevet, who climbed on a high place and fought for his finery, the mob carried off all his clothes. At last the guards succeeded in clearing the hall without bloodshed. The king, laughing heartily, handed the queen to the banquet in his own chamber, where the court sat down in their tattered condition, treating the whole scramble as a frolic, the king declaring that they must consider their losses as largesse to the commonalty. This strange scene throws light on the state of society at that time, for the outrage was not committed by a posse of London thieves, but by people in respectable stations of middle life. Since Hall says, one shipmaster of the port of London gat for his share in the scramble some letters of beaten gold, which afterwards he sold for £3 18 shillings 8 The royal infant, whose birth had caused all this uproarious joy, died February 22nd, 1511. Indeed, he had never been well since his elaborate christening, when the tender creature had taken some cold or injury. His death is thus prettily recorded in one of the manuscript folios at the Chapter House, Westminster. In the 2nd year of our lord the king, her grace the queen bore a prince, whose soul is now among the holy innocents of God. The queen, according to Hall, like a natural woman, made much lamentation. Howbeit, by the king's persuasion, she was comforted, but not shortly. Catharine could not see what a fatal shade the loss of her son was to throw on her after life, when she mourned in unconscious anticipation of all her future sorrow. A war soon after broke out with France, in which Scotland incipiently joined. Sir Edward Howard, one of England's earliest naval heroes, distinguished himself in this war by his victory over Sir Andrew Barton, a Scottish commander of equal valour. The gallant Howard fell gloriously in a desperate attack on the French galleys in Conquest Bay. He was a friend of Queen Catharine and her parents, having served as a volunteer at the siege of Granada. He bequeathed to her in his will a beautiful relic of antiquity, the Grace Cup of Thomas a Becket. The queen subsequently restored the cup to the noble family of Howard, in whose possession it still is. Sir Edward Howard had likewise, in his sailor-like will, left his whistle, then the insignia of his command, to the king, but he was seen to throw it into the sea just before he sunk, when boarding the French commander's galley. The succeeding year, when Henry VIII invaded France in person, he entrusted the queen with the highest powers that had ever yet been bestowed on a female regent in England, for he not only placed the reins of government in her hands, but made her captain of all his forces, with the assistance of 5 of his nobles. She was likewise empowered to raise loans for the defence of the kingdom. The queen accompanied her royal lord to Dover, where she was invested with this high trust. And then, says Hall, the king took leave of the queen and many of her ladies of their lords, which altogether made such sorrow that it was a great dolor to behold. And so the king and all his army took ship the last day of June. The Earl of Surrey, to whom had been confided the care of the north of England, accompanied the queen home from Dover, comforting her as well as he might. Catharine's letters, soon after her regency, begin to form interesting features of her personal history. She had made herself sufficiently mistress of the English language to express her thoughts, and issue her commands with clearness and decision. The following appears to be one of her earliest letters, as it is written during the lifetime of her father. It relates to the misconduct of one of her Spanish attendants, and is addressed to Wolsey, who was certainly the factotum of the royal family. It appears to have been written on her homeward journey from Dover. Mr. Almoner, touching Francesca de Caceres's matter, I thank you for your labour therein. True it is she was my woman before she was married, but now, since she cast herself away, I have no more charge of her. For very pity to see her lost, I pray you in Canterbury to find the means to send her home to her country. Now ye think that with my letter of recommendation to the Duchess of Savoy, she shall be content to take her into her service. This, Mr. Almoner, is not meet for her. She is so perilous a woman that it shall be dangerous to put her in a strange house. And ye will do so much for me, to make her go hence by the way, with the ambassador of the king my father. It should be to me a great pleasure, and with that ye shall bind me to you more than I ever was. Here is benevolence, mingled with prudential forecast, arising from accurate judgment of character. She pities the perilous woman who has cast herself away, and wished that care might be taken of her, without danger of doing mischief in the household of another princess. Henry won the battle of the Spurs, August 16, 1513. It was a rout of cavalry at Guienne Gate, and was thus jestingly named by the French themselves, in satirical remembrance of the only weapons they used on that day. The king was at this time besieging Terouanne, in concert with the Emperor Maximilian, who was fighting under the English banners. Catharine alludes to this emperor, her family ally, in the following letter, which is her answer to a dispatch of Wolsey's announcing the victory. Master Almoner, what comfort I have with the good tidings of your letter, I need not write to you. The victory hath been so great, that I think none such hath ever been seen before. All England hath cause to thank God of it, and I especially, seeing that the king beginneth so well, which is to me a great hope that the end shall be like. I pray God send the same shortly, for if this continues so, still I trust in him that everything shall follow thereafter to the king's pleasure and my comfort. Mr. Almoner, for the pain ye take to write to me so often, I thank you with all my heart, praying you to continue still sending me word how the king doeth, and if he keep still his good rule that he begun. I think, with the company of the emperor, and with his good counsel, his grace shall not adventure himself too much, as I was afraid of before. I was very glad to hear of the meeting of them both, which hath been, to my seeming, the greatest honour to the king that ever came to prince. The emperor hath done everything like himself. I trust to God he shall be thereby known for one of the excellentest princes in the world, and taken for another man than he was before thought. Mr. Almoner, I think myself that I am so bound to him for my part, that in my letter I beseech the king to remember it. The queen was at Richmond when she wrote this, August 25, 1513. Her signature is Katharina the Queen. The situation of Queen Catherine during her husband's absence was exactly similar to that of Queen Philippa when left regent by Edward III. Like Philippa, Catherine had to repel a Scottish invasion, and it is no little honour to female government that the two greatest victories won against the Scots, those of Neville's Cross and Flodden Field, were gained during the administration of queens. Catherine's correspondence with Wolsey at this juncture is cheerful and friendly. She viewed the coming storm with intrepidity, worthy the daughter of that great and victorious queen, Isabel of Castile, and only regrets that her removal nearer the seat of war will prevent her from hearing as speedily as usual of her husband's welfare. The following letter was written by her to Wolsey just a month before the invasion of the Scots. Maester Almoner, I received both your letters by Coppinger and John Glynn. I am very glad to hear how well the king passed his dangerous passage, the Frenchmen being present. Ye be not so busy with the war, as we be here encumbered with it. I mean touching mine own self, for going where I shall not so often hear from the king. All his subjects be very glad, I thank God, to be busy with the Scots, for they take it for pastime. My heart is very good to it, and I am horrible busy with making standards, banners, and badges. At Richmond, 13th day of August, Catharine the Queen." The queen was preparing to make a pilgrimage to the Lady Shrine of Walsingham in Norfolk when the news of the Flodden victory reached her. The letter in which she announced it to Henry commences formally, but soon falls into the tender and familiar style of an affectionate wife. "Sir, my lord Howard hath sent me a letter open to your grace within one of mine, by the which you shall see the great victory that our Lord hath sent your subjects in your absence, and for this cause it is no need herein to trouble your grace with long writing, but to my thinking this battle hath been to your grace, and all your realm, the greatest honour that could be, and more than should you win all the crown of France. Thank be God of it, and I am sure your grace forgetteth not to do this, which shall be cause to send you many more such victories as, I trust, he shall do. My husband, for hastiness with Rouge Cross, I could not send your grace the piece of the King of Scots' coat, which John Glynn now bringeth. In this your grace shall see how I can keep my promise, sending you for your banners a king's coat. I thought to send himself to you, but our Englishmen would not suffer it. It should have been better for him to have been in peace than to have this reward. All that God sendeth is for the best. My lord Surrey, my Henry, would fain know your pleasure in burying the King of Scots' body, for he hath written to me so. With the next messenger, your grace's pleasure may be herein known, and with this I make an end, praying God to send you home shortly, for, without this, no joy here can be accomplished, and for the same I pray. And now go I to Our Lady at Walsingham, that I promised so long ago to see. At Woburn, 16th of September. I send your grace herein a bill, a note, found in a Scottish man's purse, of such things as the French king sent to the said King of Scots, to make war against you, beseeching you to send Matthew hither, as soon as this messenger cometh to bring me tidings from your grace. Your humble wife and true servant, 1513, Catharine. Skelton, the poet laureate of Henry VIII's court, composed verses of the most ungenerous exultation over the fall of the Scottish monarch. In part of this poem he thus addresses the deceased king in allusion to the absence of Henry. Ye were stark mad to make a fray, his grace being then out of the way. Ye wanted wit, sir, at a word, ye lost your spurs, ye lost your sword. Ye might have boon to Hentley Branks, your pride was peevish to play such pranks. He then breaks into the most vulgar taunts of the unconscious hero, who lay cold in his clay, abusing him as Jemmy the Scot, with a degree of virulence which would have disgusted any mind less coarse than that of his master. The beautiful lyric, called The Flowers of the Forest, in which Scotland bewailed her loss at Flodden, forms a noble contrast to this lampoon. But the laureated bard of Henry knew well his sovereign's taste, for it is affirmed that Skelton had been tutor to Henry in some department of his education. How probable it is that the corruption imparted by this ribald and ill-living wretch laid the foundation for his royal pupil's grossest crimes. After the battle of Flodden, Queen Catharine performed her vow of pilgrimage to the Walsingham shrine. She returned time enough to welcome the king, who landed privately at Dover the latter end of September, and rode post, incognito, to surprise the queen at Richmond, where, observes Hall, there was such a loving meeting that every one rejoiced who witnessed it. But notwithstanding this tender greeting, Henry had permitted his heart to wander from his queen during his absence, for it was during his sojourn at Calais in this campaign that he first saw the beautiful wife of Sir Gilbert Tailbois. This lady, after the death of her husband, bore Henry a son in 1519, to whom he gave the name of Henry Fitzroy. For several years this was the only instance of Henry's infidelity to Catharine. His connection with Lady Tailbois was carried on with little publicity. They met at a place devoted to Henry's pleasures, which he called Jericho, situated near Newhall, in Essex. The The French war concluded with a marriage between Louis XII. And the king's beautiful young sister Mary, whose heart was devoted to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Catherine accompanied the royal bride to Dover, October 1514, and bade her an affectionate and tearful farewell. With Mary went as an attendant Anne Boleyn, then a girl. The November following, the queen again became the mother of a living prince, but the infant died in a few days, to her infinite sorrow. The king on his New Year's night performed a ballet with the Duke of Suffolk and 2 noblemen and 4 ladies, all dressed in cloth of silver and blue velvet, after the mode of Savoy, the young and blooming Duchess of Savoy being supposed to be in love with Suffolk. This mask entered the queen's presence by a great light of torches, and, after dancing a long time, put off their visors, and when they were known, the queen heartily thanked the king's grace for her good pastime and kissed him. On the very day this ballet was danced, the King of France died, and his lovely bride was left a widow after 82 days of marriage. In a very short time, she stole a match with the Duke of Suffolk at Paris, who had been sent by the king to take care of her and her property. All the influence of Queen Catherine, who called Wolsey to her assistance, was needful to appease the wrath of King Henry at the presumption of his favourite. The married lovers were, however, favourably received at Greenwich Palace by the queen, and publicly married after the Easter of 1515. Suffolk bore on his motto at the festival on this occasion the well-known couplet he wrote on his marriage: Cloth of gold do not despise, thou hast wedded cloth of fries. The May Day after this royal love match was distinguished by a most picturesque and poetical festival, such as never more was witnessed in England. Catherine and the royal bride rode a Maying with the king from the Palace of Greenwich to Shooter's Hill. Here the archers of the king's guard met them dressed like Robin Hood and his outlaws, and begged that the royal party would enter the good green wood and see how outlaws lived. On this, Henry, turning to the queen, asked her, if she and her damsels would venture in a thicket with so many outlaws? Catherine replied, that where he went, she was content to go. The king then handed her to a sylvan bower, formed of hawthorn boughs, spring flowers, and moss, with apartments adjoining, where was laid out a breakfast of venison. The queen partook of the feast, and was greatly delighted with this lodge in the wilderness. When she returned towards Greenwich with the king, they met on the road a flowery car, drawn by 5 horses. Each was ridden by a fair damsel. The ladies and their steeds personated the attributes of spring. The horses had their names lettered on their headgear, and the damsels had theirs on their dresses. The first steed was Cowed, or Heat. On him sat the lady Humid. The second was Memeon, on which rode the lady Vert, or Verdure. On the third, called Phaeton, was the lady Vegetative. On the steed Rimphon sat the lady Pleasance. On the fifth, Lampace, sat the lady Sweet Odor. In the car was the lady May, attended by Flora. All these damsels burst into a sweet song when they met the queen at the foot of Shooter's Hill, and preceded the royal party carolling hymns to the May, till they reached Greenwich Palace. The amusements of the day concluded with the king and his brother-in-law, the Duke of Suffolk, riding races on great coursers, which were like the Flemish breed of dray horses. Strange races these must have been, for this is the first mention of horse racing made in English history. Catherine again became a mother, and this time her hopes were not blighted. She brought into the world a girl, February 18, 1516, who was likely to live. This infant was baptized Mary, after her aunt, the Queen of France. At the same time the death of the queen's father, Ferdinand of Aragon, took place, and solemn requiems were sung for him at St. Paul's. Nothing can show the disposition of Catherine in its truly beautiful character more than the motives which led to her intimacy with the daughter of Clarence. When Ferdinand of Castile demurred on the marriage of his daughter Catherine to Prince Arthur, his excuse was, that while a male heir bearing the name of Plantagenet existed, the crown of England was not secure in the Tudor family. Whereupon Henry VII had the innocent Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick, led out to execution, without a shadow of justice. The conscience of the excellent Catharine was infinitely grieved at this murder, of which she considered herself the cause, though innocently so. As far as was in her power, she made every reparation to the relatives of the unfortunate son of Clarence. She cultivated the friendship of his sister, Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, who was in her household at Ludlow. She gave her infant Mary to be suckled by Catharine Pole, the relative of the countess. She treated her son Reginald Pole as if he had been her own, and it is said that she wished this gentleman to become her son-in-law. The great talents of Reginald, his beauty and noble courage, distinguished him from all his brothers. He was, however, brought up to the church. Queen Catharine welcomed at her Greenwich palace Queen Margaret, widow of James IV., who had taken refuge with Henry VIII. From the troubles in Scotland. The Scottish queen brought her daughter by her second husband, the Earl of Angus. This infant was a few months older than the Princess Mary, and was reared as her companion, being at the same time regarded with affection by the king and queen. Her name is of some consequence in history as Lady Margaret Douglas. The national jealousy of the Londoners regarding foreigners broke out into formidable insurrection of the apprentices in London, which is called in our domestic history Ill May Day. There is no evidence that the queen unduly patronized foreigners, yet the popular fury was directed against her countrymen. Several Spanish merchants' houses were sacked and burnt, and the inhabitants were murdered. The Duke of Norfolk, who had been incensed by the recent murder of a priest of his household by the citizens, was sent to quell the uproar, and then proceeded to dispense martial law in the turbulent metropolis. This he did with such vengeance that dozens of the unfortunate boys who had raised the riot were soon seen hanging over their masters' signposts. As several hundred apprentices were captives to the vengeful duke, their mothers supposed all were to be immolated in the same manner. Calling together all their female relatives, they went to the palace, and with streaming eyes raised such a piteous wail for mercy that the queen heard the cry of maternal agony in the retirement of her chamber. She summoned her sister queens, Margaret of Scotland and Mary of France, to aid her. They flew with dishevelled hair to the king, and kneeling before him, begged for pity on the misguided boys. Every one was struck with the benevolence of Queen Catharine, because the rioters had directed their fury against her nation. This incident is commemorated to her honour in a ballad poem of her times, which preserves many curious traits of that era. What if, she said, by Spanish blood have London's stately streets been wet? Yet I will seek this country's good, and pardon for their children get. Or else the world will speak of me, and say Queen Catharine was unkind, and judge me still the cause to be, these young men did misfortune find. And so disrobed of rich attires, with hair unbound she sadly hies, of her gracious lord requires a boon, which hardly he denies. The lives, quoth she, of all the blooms, yet budding green, these youths, I crave. O let them not have timeless tombs, for nature longer limits gave. In saying so, the pearl tears fell trickling from her princely eyes, whereat his gentle queen he cheers, and says, Stand up, sweet lady, rise. The lives of them I freely give, no means this kindness shall debar. Thou hast thy boon, and they may live, to serve me in my Boulogne war. No sooner was this pardon given, but peals of joy rang through the hall, as though it thundered down from heaven, the queen's renown amongst them all. For which, kind queen, with joyful heart, she heard her mother's thanks and praise, and so from them did gently part, and lived beloved all her days. And at the siege of Tours in France, they showed themselves brave Englishmen. At Boulogne, too, they did advance, St. George's lofty standard then. But ill May Day, and ill May games, performed in young and tender years, can be no hindrance to their fames, or stains of valour many ways. But now the watch, ordained by law, we see on May Day's eve at night, is kept to fill the youth with awe, by London bands in armour bright. The fact that Catherine brought the king 5 children has been disputed, but evidence exists in a letter written by Henry VIII to his council 18 months after the birth of the Princess Mary, in which he announces that the queen was likely to bring him an heir. Richard Pace soon after wrote to Wolsey that, after the king's return to Windsor, the queen met him at her chamber door, and gave him information which confirmed his hopes. She soon after brought him a 3rd son, who died as soon as he saw the light. After this disappointment, the king created Henry Fitzroy, the son he had by Lady Tailbois, Duke of Richmond, and owned him with a degree of parade which showed Catherine how earnestly desirous he was of male offspring. This circumstance seems to have given the queen more uneasiness than any jealousy ever occasioned by the boy's mother. In the spring of 1520, Queen Catherine had the satisfaction of welcoming in England her nephew, who afterwards made his name so illustrious as the Emperor Charles V. He was the eldest son of the insane Queen Joanna, Catherine's sister, and was regent of Spain and possessor of Holland and the Low Countries. He had been recently elected Emperor of Germany. According to Bishop Godwin, the emperor arrived at Dover, May 26th, on his return from Spain. Catherine awaited her nephew at the archbishop's palace at Canterbury, while Henry rode by torchlight to Dover Castle, where he arrived in the middle of the night, when the emperor, sea-weary, was fast asleep. But, being awakened with the bustle of the king's entrance into the castle, he rose and met him at the top of the stairs, where Henry embraced and welcomed him. The next morning the king brought the emperor to Queen Catherine, who received him joyfully. After 3 days' banqueting at Canterbury, the emperor went to his navy at Sandwich, while Henry and Catherine embarked at Dover, the emperor having appointed a second meeting with them on the opposite coast. Henry and Catherine, with their court, then proceeded to that congress with the king and queen of France, between Ardres and Guisnes, which has been called for its magnificence, the Field of Cloth of Gold, and the Golden Camp. Catherine had here the satisfaction of forming an intimacy with a royal lady whose mind was a kindred one with her own. This was Claude, Queen of France, surnamed the Good. The chroniclers who dwell on this epoch notice that the queens of France and England visited each other every day in familiar intercourse. One morning, when Cardinal Wolsey officiated at high mass before the assembled courts at Guisnes, the kings, Henry and Francis, received the Eucharist as a pledge of the peace they so soon broke. Then the cardinal advanced to the separate oratory where Queen Catherine of England and Queen Claude of France were kneeling side by side. Before they communicated, these royal ladies tenderly embraced and kissed each other, in a token of mutual amity and goodwill. Catherine fully participated in all the tedious splendours of the Field of Gold, for even the foot carpet of her throne was embroidered with pearls. Lord Herbert declares that Queen Claude certainly brought Anne Boleyn in her train as one of her maids of honour, but the presence of this young lady was as yet of no moment to the royal Catherine, although her mind had already been somewhat troubled by the coquetries of the other sister, Mary Boleyn, with King Henry. The emperor joined the congress of the Camp of Gold towards its conclusion. Catherine and her court went to meet her imperial nephew at Gravelines, and he accompanied them to Calais. Henry invited him to a grand entertainment at that town, where an amphitheatre was built in imitation of a firmament. But, an unfortunate storm happening the night of the festival, it blew out 1,000 wax tapers, overturning the thrones erected for Henry, Catherine, and the emperor, and rendered the sun, moon, and stars unfit for use. The court looked grave, and began to whisper regarding the presumption of making a firmament. Notwithstanding this mishap, Catherine entertained her nephew for 6 days at Calais, till he departed to Gravelines, mounted on a beautiful English horse, with a footcloth of gold tissue, bordered with precious stones, which Catherine had given him. He often spoke of his aunt's happiness, who was wedded to so magnificent a prince as Henry VIII. While Queen Catherine retained her place and influence, the career of improvement commenced, which has ever since continued to progress in this country. With her name was connected the revival of horticulture in England. We use the term revival because there is ample proof in the pages of Matthew Paris, Chaucer, and Lombardy that many plants were cultivated in England, which were totally lost after the long course of warfare, foreign and domestic, had agonized the country and perverted her energetic population into mischievous destructives. The cherry, the plum, and the peach tree, the laurel and the bay tree, are familiarly mentioned by the earlier historians, and by Chaucer, but they had vanished from the land in 1500, and had to be reimported. When Catharine of Aragon wished for salads, an important article of food in Spain, the whole fair realm of England could not furnish one for her table, till King Henry sent for a gardener from Flanders to cultivate them for her. There were no carrots and not an edible root grown, all the cabbages were imported from Holland, yet as Edward II was blamed for buying them from a Thames faggot boat, it is evident that they were, in the 13th century, grown as now on the banks of the river. An old rhyme, often quoted, preserves the memory of the introduction of some other useful things. Hops and turkeys, carps and beer, came to England all in one year. Wherefore the hop was cultivated is rather enigmatical, since Henry VIII, who interfered in all the concerns of his subjects, from their religion to their beer barrels, forbade them to put hops in their ale. Perhaps the above sapient distich means to imply that malt liquor was first called beer when brewed with hops. The rhyme is right enough regarding the turkeys, since they were first brought from North America by William Strickland, the lieutenant of Sebastian Cabot, in the expeditions of discovery he undertook under the patronage of Henry VII. And this recalls to memory a curious article in the privy purse expenses of that monarch. To the man in reward who found the new isle, 10 pounds. The man was the illustrious Cabot. The isle, Newfoundland. Scanty is the reward of the benefactors of the human race, dim are their records, and few there be that find them, while those of the destroyers are blazoned before all eyes. End of Section 6.